Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War, and we are on to week 197. Pershing under pressure, the end of La Ligue. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I'd love if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch, and please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube where I upload old streams and dumb clips, because I like embarrassing myself here on the internet. Though I feel like the people that watch this series, you guys already, if you are interested in all that, you guys already have done all that stuff. So, anyways, with all that said, really got nothing to add here at the beginning of this video. Let's just dive straight into it. I wonder when can't remember when do the Americans start arriving? Because we are well into spring by now. Was it the summer? I thought they arrived by mid-spring, 1918. Anyways.
Away from the front lines of war, day-to-day life still goes on, sometimes even seemingly normal. But the war and life at home cross paths all the time, and one such way is trials of civilians for treason.
Uh-oh.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week saw a British naval raid in Belgium, failed German attacks in Flanders and France, the latter featuring the first tank-on-tank battle in history, Americans fighting in France, Transcaucasian independence and Ottoman advance in eastern Anatolia, and the death of the Red Baron.
We got a lot.
The Germans continued their attacks in Flanders for part of this week. On the 29th, they attacked with 13 divisions on a 16-kilometer front, but could not make headway. This, the final attack of Operation Georgette, was called off by the evening, and the operation, also called the Battle of La Lys, was called off May the 1st. The German official history called it a skillful and effective operational chess move, but despite tactical results, it was an operational failure. It didn't accomplish either of its primary objectives, first to take Hazebrouck and then to take the Flanders Hills. Total casualties for Operations Michael and Georgette, going back to March 21st, were heavier for the combined Allies than the Germans. 325,000 for the Germans, 260,000 for the British, and 107,000 for the French. But the Germans were only one nation. David Zabecki notes in the German 1918 offensives that in Georgette, the Germans made the same mistake that they had during Michael. When it became clear that they were not going to take their original objective, they continued the attack in the hope of taking something to show for their efforts. But German Army Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff was determined to win the war in the West before the Americans could arrive in force, since they may turn the tide. The Americans were indeed arriving in France in droves by now, and the Allies needed to arm them. The British Ministry of Munitions under Winston Churchill was making huge efforts to increase production of not just arms, but tanks and aircraft for their ally. In early May, they could offer the Americans 225 big guns for the summer. There would be more later in the year, but that was for the offensives of 1919, when the Americans in Europe were expected to number over 3 million. The Allied planners were hard at work on next year's plans. In fact, Plan 19, which comes out...
What's so funny, right? Because now we this is something we have, right? This is another one of the things where we have the context of we know what happens, right? Like the people saying in 1914 that the war will be over by Christmas. We obviously know that did not happen, but they were not aware of it. We now this is a little bit of a twist. We know the war ends by November 11th, 1918. But here we are hearing that they're making plans for 1919. That's just, I don't know. That's something that you don't really hear pointed out. You hear people point out, like, oh, they expected the war to be over by this point in time. You never hear about how by 1918 they were planning for this war to keep going.
Later this month, calls for nearly 5,000 Allied tanks making next year's breakthrough in the West. But as for now, on May 1st, there was a Supreme War Council meeting and it did not go well. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and then Allied Commander-in-Chief Ferdinand Foch all took turns trying to convince American Commander John Pershing to do what U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had requested and send American troops into the line at once. Foch even went so far as to say that if this did not happen, all was lost. Pershing held his ground. Lloyd George agreed to a separate American army in principle, but said, "We are engaged in what is perhaps the decisive battle of the war. If we lose this battle, we shall need tonnage to take home what left there is of the British and American armies." That didn't work either. Foch asked Pershing if he was willing to risk the Allies being driven back to the Loire. He said yes, he'd take that risk because there may come a time when Americans would have to stand the brunt of the war, and he didn't want to fritter away resources. The next
Pershing, an American general, is going to be the smartest general of the war? Whoa. You don't really expect to hear that by this point in time. You like, I've said before, and if you look at American history, American generalship is typically never that good. Like, Robert E. Lee, not a good general. I mean, in terms of his compatriot, his people of his time, his fellow officers of his time and whatnot, it was the best the Confederates had. I think the Union had at least 2 generals that were superior to him. Grant was one of them. It's like, and I mean, Grant is a good general, but I wouldn't think of him as a great general, you know? No American generals in my eye really get to the status of great. Xiao. Well, I would say Eisenhower, but really, again, as I talked about, I think in this previous Great War episode, American generalship, where the American Army does best is organization and logistics. That is the strength of the American military, and not actual strategic or tactical maneuvering. It's just keeping the troops supplied and alive, which you could argue is a very hard skill to have. Depends on your perspective on that sort of thing, right? That could be a very not all generals, as we're seeing here in World War One, have that skill or capability. But American generals, at least Pershing, has that pretty much ingrained in that thinking ingrained in him as to how to fight the war. Don't know if that side tangent there made any sense.
day, Lloyd George pointed out to Pershing the enormous British and French casualties since March 21st and said, "If the United States does not come to our aid, then perhaps the enemy's calculations will be correct. If France and Great Britain should have to yield, their defeat would be honorable, for they would have fought to their last man, while the United States would have to stop without having put into the line more men than little Belgium." Pershing had a compromise, though, and the others really had no choice other than to accept it. The 130,000 American soldiers coming over during May, British ships, and the 150,000 more in June could join the Allied line, but there would be no provision for July. That means that there would soon be 800,000 total American troops in Europe, and 2/3 of those would not join the line until they could do so as an American army. You can imagine how happy the other allies were about this. Still, they were at least getting some reinforcements of their own. In April, British General Edmund Allenby had to send over 30,000 of his troops from Palestine to the Western Front, and more would go in May. The smaller his force became, though, the more he had to rely on the Arab revolt to capture Mons and secure his eastern flank. But they had failed to do that 2 weeks ago. Theoretically, the safest thing for him to do would be to retreat to where he couldn't be outflanked from Mons, but that would mean giving up Jerusalem. Local tribesmen volunteered to cut off the Ottoman supply route from Amman during a British attack on Es Salt. Allenby was hoping to deny the Ottomans the grain harvest of the region, and he thinks the people of Salt are prepared to lay down their lives for the Sharif. On May 1st, the British captured Es Salt, but at the end of the week are forced to withdraw from it back across the River Jordan by vicious counterattacks. The local help attacking the supply line never materialized, and Allenby's force took 1,500 casualties. The Ottomans continued to reinforce Mons, and over 700 townspeople in Es Salt were killed as reprisals. Now, no one there wanted to support the Sharif. So this was more of a political disaster than anything for Allenby. And someone who was recovering from a political disaster was Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl. In early May, he met German leaders at Spa. German Foreign Minister Richard von Kuhlmann insisted he accept German demands for a military pact and a trade convention. After the Sixtus affair became public last month, there was some real distrust for Karl in German high command. German and Austrian Army Chiefs of Staff Paul von Hindenburg and Arz von Straußenberg signed an agreement that both countries would mobilize every available man, coordinate troop training and deployment, exchange officers, and share war plans. The world saw this as total Austrian subservience to Berlin. Many among the Allies now wondered if there was any point letting Austria-Hungary survive. German authority was growing elsewhere too. On May the 1st, German troops occupy Sevastopol, disband the Ukrainian Rada, and establish a monarchistic hetmanate under General Pavlo Skoropadsky. The Rada had made an arrangement with the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries, to fight the Bolsheviks, right? In return, they had to agree to a redistribution of farmlands among the peasants. This, however, ran contrary to the Central Powers' need for immediate grain supplies that only the wealthy Ukrainian landowners were able to guarantee. So the conservatives, under Skoropadsky, who only actually spoke a little Ukrainian, being Russian, staged a coup against the Rada with German support. The Ukrainian harvest will now be gathered for the German war effort. There were also those in
good way to make some friends, huh?
Allied nations that weren't averse to working with the Germans. The Bonnet Rouge treason trial opens in France this week. Bonnet Rouge was a socialist, anarchist French newspaper accused of having German financial backing and engaging in propaganda for the enemy. 7 people were charged with espionage and communication and commerce with the enemy. It seems that Bonnet Rouge had a report of conditions in French General Maurice Sarrail's army in Salonika. It was a complete report showing that Sarrail was unable to make an offensive, listing his exact casualties in recent battles, and detailing the number of men stricken by illness. It was, in fact, a copy of a document Sarrail sent to the French government detailing the situation. A former stenographer for Bonnet Rouge identified the document, which she had typed at her employer's request. These and other materials had been given to Bonnet Rouge by Sergeant P. Seailly, who himself had been suspected of giving important military information to unauthorized persons months ago. He was tried by court-martial and admitted on the stand to giving documents to one of the accused who are suspected of giving them to Germany through neutral Spain. This is just one part of the Bonnet Rouge trial, though, which will last until the middle of May. A principal witness, Lieutenant Marchand, an interpreter in the French army and an expert in German propaganda, will testify next week.
Oh boy.
And this week comes to an end, as does the Battle of La Lys and the British attempt to take Es Salt. German command is asserting more control of Ukraine and Austria. The Americans are now arriving in force, and a notable trial begins in France. Martin Gilbert wrote in the First World War, "The Battle of La Lys was a turning point not only in German military fortunes, but in German battlefield morale. Many soldiers were depressed and exhausted, seeing no further prospect of breaching the Allied line. It was nearly 4 years since Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo. Who could now remember the causes and sequences, twists and turns, charges and countercharges, which had led to such a widespread and all-consuming war? Yet, the repercussions of Gavrilo Princip's act were being acted out in blood without any end in sight." And as for Gavrilo Princip, on April 28, 1918, this week, in the Austrian fortress town of Theresienstadt, where he was held prisoner, Gavrilo Princip died of tuberculosis, age 22.
22? He was 22. Damn. Didn't know I was older than him.
One of the smaller nations in the war that fought at the Battle of La Lys was Portugal, and if you'd like to learn more about Portuguese participation in the war, you can click right here for our special.
And that was Pershing under pressure. The end of La Lys, the Great War, week 197. This was a good week. Nothing really too exciting to really nothing to really talk about in this week. Just a bunch of things happening where they didn't really lend themselves, I feel, to further discussion. But man, got nothing else to add here. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.